All right, sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. So my name is Carrie Lee. I'm an Assistant Director of Career Development here at the Career Planning and Development Center. So today we're going to be talking about mastering common interview questions. So we'll go through some kind of basic information about interviewing strategies, kind of how to approach these questions, way to structure answers, and then I'll go through some actual examples of those typical questions, like suggested ways to approach that, what sorts of information you want to include with those, and then kind of questions to follow up with to ask an employer after your interview. So we'll go ahead and get started. If you have questions, feel free to just put those in the chat. So with interviewing, this is something where you definitely do want to put in a little bit of preparation. It's going to help you feel more confident, be in a much better situation because, some people may feel more or less confident or have more or less experience in terms of interviewing itself. But doing that prep is something that stands out, especially when you're interviewing multiple candidates. It's often kind of easier to tell who did a little bit of research about the organization, about the position, and who didn't. So I do think that can be time well spent. So a couple of things I would definitely make sure to go through. So, make sure you have the posting saved. So for some sites, when you apply, you can just find those in your history. You can reference those at any time. For other job boards, sometimes those postings will disappear after the close date. So that's something as you're going through your job search, you just want to be aware of. So you have copies of those. You can refer to those later because all of those like requirements, qualifications, things that they specifically put in the posting, that's typically where they're going to draw from the questions. So you want to make sure that you're thinking through those basic things and that you're going to have examples, opportunities that you can share that refer to those requirements and qualifications in the posting. If you happen to have a connection there, that can be really great to get a little bit more information about, like the work environment, the culture at that company, maybe some more specific questions to ask about. So, that's certainly something that can be helpful, even if that's someone who maybe doesn't work in that specific department or exactly in that type of role, but, it's somebody that still works in that organization. That can still be beneficial. Otherwise, certainly LinkedIn can be a really good resource for that, using the alumni tool or the people tool if you're looking just for contacts of a specific organization. And then definitely doing a little bit of research about the organization itself. So, going through their website, they're often going to have some information about like their mission, values as an organization, kind of what are their products, services that they offer, any kind of current initiatives. So not that you need to know the entire company's history by any means, but that you have a basic sense of what do they do. And certainly there are some resources through Webster Library, so kind of more professional or journals, kind of like those basic facts about a company, kind of like financial analysis, things like that. Otherwise, I think it can be helpful to look at places like Glassdoor or even just looking kind of Google News to see, is there anything that's coming up recently, whether that's positive or negative, can give you some information. Or if you're noticing some themes on Glassdoor, that may kind of give you some ideas in terms of questions you want to ask about if there's particular themes that keep coming up. So in terms of interviews, obviously these days everyone's pretty comfortable, I think, with Zoom, virtual interview. A lot of places are going to do that, at least for first round interviews. Telephone interviews oftentimes are more kind of that first round screening interview. So sometimes you may have like an initial interview with somebody from HR. So may not be as long, more of like, 20, 30 minutes. And they're kind of making sure that your skills, experiences line up with that position, getting a little bit more detail from you than your resume, there aren't any red flags, etc. So something you always want to be really conscious of in terms of phone interviews is just your connection. Obviously, you're not having background noise. You do want to try to have kind of an interesting tone. If you're really flat, kind of very like monotone voice, it can be a little bit harder to stay engaged. Try to avoid all of those filler words as much as one can. If you have questions that you need to think about for a minute, so maybe it's something that you weren't expecting them to ask about, I would always acknowledge that. So, thanks for asking. That's a great question. Let me think about that for a moment, because that just helps. Otherwise, sometimes people may not be clear if you didn't hear the question, you didn't understand it. So just to acknowledge that you're taking a moment to think about that. You definitely can reference things, with a phone call. You just want to make sure it's not shuffling paper noises in the background, or, that it sounds like you're reading off a script or anything like that. Sometimes interviews may be just one-on-one. So like with that specific manager, for the position, an HR representative. For a lot of professional interviews, it's probably going to be more of a panel situation where there are multiple individuals. So, maybe potential colleagues as well as supervisor, etc. Group interviews, really much more in terms of like graduate school, or sometimes for like on-campus positions, where there's multiple candidates in a room. So sometimes there's sort of assessing like teamwork skills. So giving groups different tasks, kind of taking notes on how people observe and act in those situations. And then these days, kind of depends with the company if they are running more remotely or in person, if you'll have like an in-person interview. Meal interviews aren't particularly common these days, but that's certainly something that can come up. So typical structure, you're always going to want to arrive a few minutes early, kind of be polite, professional. Again, handshake, some people are more comfortable with that these days or not. So typically I would just take the cue from them. If they're offering, may want to go for it, or if not, maybe, play it a little safe and just do the kind of acknowledging wave or head nod. They may give you a little bit more details about the position before they go into the interview questions. And then typically, depending how long the interview is, if it's like a 30, 45-minute, hour-long interview, probably anywhere from like 7 to 15 questions, I would say is typical for an interview. And then they're usually going to leave you a little bit of time at the end to ask your questions about the position, about that organization. So that's pretty much always going to be the general process. Something else I just always would think about is make sure you know the names of who you're interviewing with, because when you want to follow up, kind of send a thank you after the interview, you want to make sure you know who that person is, how to spell their name. So, if that's something where you already have access because it's somebody you've been emailing with, or you get their business card, but just to kind of make sure that you have that information. So in terms of answering questions, one resource I wanted to mention is something called My Interview Practice. And so that's a subscription service that you can make a free account with your Webster email. So as long as you have an active Webster email, you can access that. So you can simply use this link, go there, make an account, and they have kind of a variety of practice questions. So you can just go through those if you wish, or you can record yourself. So both audio and visual, or either or. So when you do that, you can just use it for your own purposes, kind of reflect on your practice answers. You can send it. So if you would like to send it to your career advisor for feedback, you can do that. Or you could also send it to someone else. So if you have like a mentor or a friend, somebody that you want to look over that, that's an easy way to do that. And as you're kind of prepping for an interview, I think it's always helpful just to kind of keep your notes in one place. So some of those typical answers that we're going to talk through, examples that you're really proud of from your work history or academic experiences, keeping those all in one place is just going to make it really easy to refer to for future interviews. So there's kind of two basic frameworks that I would consider using for most interview questions. So there are some of these general ones that we'll talk about that are more open-ended, but a lot of interview questions you're going to encounter are posed more as behavioral questions. So behavioral questions are really focused on transferable skills a lot of times. So things that are applicable across settings like, leadership, organization, attention to detail, work ethic, those sorts of skills. And so how you acted in a situation in the past is usually going to be the best predictor of how you would approach that situation in the future. So that's why they're looking for specific examples of how you use those skills or how you approach a particular type of situation. So the first kind of method you can do to address these are the 3 Ps. So the first thing, just kind of pondering, what are they trying to get at here? So if they're asking about, tell us about a time that you showed initiative, that you went above and beyond what was expected. So, thinking about what's most important to them, what's a situation I can share that seems relevant to what they're asking, and is kind of a positive way that you've demonstrated that. You always want to prove your statements. So, sometimes you may have questions that you haven't ever had that situation come up. It is a little bit more theoretical answer, but in general, you do want to always try to provide an actual specific situation. So when I was in this particular role, this is what was happening. These are the steps that I took, instead of kind of generalize like, oh, when, customers come in, they're, frustrated with their current sales contract. This is how I do that. So kind of thinking more of a specific than those generalized situations, because it's just going to give your interviewers a much better sense of kind of your depth and breadth of experience. And you always want to make sure and just project positivity. So, sometimes they may ask you a little bit negative slanted questions. So, tell us about a time you didn't meet a deadline, or, tell us about a time when presentation didn't go the way you planned. So for those, you still want to kind of make sure your answer is positive. So sharing, what have you learned from that situation? So what would you have done differently in the future now? What are you doing to work on that weakness? So still kind of bringing it back around to focusing on the positive. The other framework that some of you might be aware of is something called the STAR method. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. So for situation, you want to make sure and explain the context. So, what role was this? Where were you working? What was kind of going on? The task is what the challenge was, so what was the main issue? What were you responsible for? And then you want to delve into the specific actions that you took. Because sometimes people do a good job of explaining the context, but they don't really specify what you specifically did. So make sure to kind of go through those exact examples and then emphasize what was the actual result. So what happened? And the result part is what most people tend to miss. And, sometimes people do a great job of describing a situation, you get invested, and then you're like, well, what happened? Like, did you meet that contract? Did this sale go well? Or did it not? What would you have done differently? So as an example, you might think about a question that asks, describe a situation that exemplifies your communication skills. So for the situation, thinking about, okay, you were communications chair for a local nonprofit, and you needed to communicate information, promote an annual 5K charity race to the public. The task is that you needed to create a communication plan. You wanted to grow attendance from previous years. So that was your main goal there. And in terms of specific actions that you took, you might contact a local news outlet. So promote events on social media, create some spotlight posts on individuals who were positively impacted by your nonprofit. Make sure that your website is full of the right information, maybe partnering with other companies, nonprofits to promote your event. So those were those kind of specific actions that you took. And then what was the result? So maybe you were able to increase your social media presence by 200 additional followers. You had 50 more attendees at the event than you had last year. There was a write-up in the local newspaper about your event. So what was that overall result? What did you learn from that situation? So when you're putting that together in a response, it might sound something a little bit like this. So in my role as communications chair for Be Empowered, I communicated information about the annual 5K charity race to raise money for local cancer survivor resource groups. We wanted to increase our attendance numbers from the previous year, so I developed a strategic communications plan. I contacted local news outlets, as well as local charities and entities like the university and public library system to feature information about our event. Additionally, I promoted the event on Facebook and Instagram and made spotlight posts on individuals impacted by the charity. As a result of my communications plan, more than 200 followers were added to our social media accounts, and registration was increased by 50 attendees than the previous year. The event was highlighted in a local newspaper article, and overall the event was a success for our charity and increased donations. So that's kind of an example of how you would put together that information. Typically for behavioral questions are getting asked, you generally want to kind of shoot for that 1 to 3 minute response, because if it's closer to 30 seconds, it's less than a minute, you probably aren't giving quite enough detail or information. They're probably not going to know a whole lot more about you than what was on your resume. But if it's more than 3 minutes, that's too much information, that's too much detail for them. So kind of thinking about that as a guide. So some of just those basic, kind of professional things to remember. So obviously, nonverbals, if you have any nervous habits, kind of thinking what can you do to avoid that. So if you're somebody that messes with your hair, making sure your hair is pulled back, or if you're prone to spinning, if you have a spinny chair, maybe choosing a different chair that day. So just being aware of those things, being aware of kind of your volume, tone of voice. People tend to speak more quickly when they're nervous. So generally kind of taking a breath, making sure to slow down a little bit is probably going to bring you back to that usual rate of speed for you. And sometimes people are a little bit concerned about not wanting to appear like boastful or like bragging about their experiences. And I think something to think about is that you're the best person to talk about what you've done, right? If you're not kind of sharing information about your successes, your accomplishments, no one else is going to do that for you. So the difference where it kind of crosses that territory into feeling more like bragging or kind of being more boastful is when you're using that absolute language. So if you're saying like, I'm the best candidate for the position, you're claiming to be, the best event planner at your current company, that's where it maybe feels more like, if you are not being as humble, if you're just sharing about like, oh, here was this event, I successfully ran, here's what happened. Those are just sharing facts about what you've done. So that's kind of how I would approach that. Like I mentioned earlier, if you are kind of thrown off with a question, you're maybe not quite sure how to respond right away, just acknowledge that, like, let me think about that for a moment. Just trying to reflect on the situation. And so you're just acknowledging that you heard their question, you have things to say. I would always try to come up with some response. I would really avoid kind of like skipping to the next question, as it were. So even if you haven't done something, kind of sharing what was the closest relevant experience you had, or how would you approach it if you haven't done that before. So now kind of going into some examples of questions. So these are some of the most common ones that are going to get asked that you may have come across in an interview. So tell me about yourself. Why do people ask this question? It feels like a very generic thing to ask someone. They've looked at your resume. It is a very open-ended question, and it gives insight into somebody depending on what they choose to share. So sometimes people just share too much about their lives, not necessarily things that are negative, but it doesn't necessarily matter to somebody if you're like, well, you have 3 cats, I love to tap dance in my free time. That's not really what they want to know. You want to kind of keep it focused on your career. And the 3 things I would always kind of consider addressing here is sort of present, past, future. So, who are you? Like, what are you doing right now? So what's your current role? Are you currently pursuing a degree? What type of degree? And then what have you done in the past? So those could be, work experiences, internships, involvement. But what do you want to share about those other experiences or skills that you have? And then kind of that future, like, where are you going? So what's kind of your goal here? Kind of tying that into the position. So, if you're talking about your relevant experiences and then saying, like, well, I'm really interested, in this accounting position here at Deloitte. So I'm excited to, share more about how my skills could be a good fit here. So you're kind of just smoothing into the next question. Depending on the organization, sometimes there are additional things that you do want to share. So even if it's not maybe necessarily work related, but like you've had a positive experience with that company, or, like if you're applying for a job at Purina, maybe it is relevant to mention that you have pets, something like that. But if it's not relevant to the position, then that's something that you want to avoid. So an example of what you kind of might choose to share for an answer is to say something like the following. So, hi, my name is Carrie. I'm a senior education major at Webster University. I will graduate with my bachelor's degree in May and have certification in early childhood education. I'm currently an apprentice teacher in a kindergarten classroom in the Maplewood Richmond Heights School District. Over the last 2 years, I've developed my teaching skills through involvement with the Webster Student Literacy Corps and practicums. So those experiences have helped me develop lesson planning and classroom management skills. When I graduate, I'm excited about being able to teach elementary students in a public school setting in St. Louis. So you're addressing that kind of present, past, future. You're sharing a little bit about yourself, your goals, but still doing it in a somewhat concise way. So something else that people are often going to get asked about is, their interest. So whether that's, why are you interested in this particular position? Why are you interested in going into social work? Why are you interested in working at Edward Jones? So you want to think about how you can show that you've done some research so that you know something about that organization, the position. So certainly you want to kind of share something specific about that job. So try to avoid those sort of generic statements about, location, or like, oh, this company has a great reputation. This would be a great way for me to get more experience in this area. Those things can all be true, but you want to focus on something more than that. So for instance, maybe when you were going to their website, you connected to something in their kind of mission or values as an organization. So maybe they're really focused on kind of sustainability. So that's something that, like, in their building design, they're focused on. So that's something that appeals to you. You want to mention that. Or, maybe you've had a personal experience with their products, services as a company. There's something unique about the role. So, if you're really, focused in on a particular aspect of the job posting. So if you're, looking for a data analytics focused position and you're like, I love working with Tableau, getting to create data visualizations, like this is what I most enjoy. And I was so excited to see that, this was part of the role, like, again, kind of indicating you've gone through that posting. Or, sometimes if they have had recognition, so maybe, their management training program is something that's been recognized by other companies, kind of industry awards, things like that. So those are all kind of more specific ways to indicate that you know something about that opportunity. And I will tell you, as somebody that has done a lot of interviews, both mock and actual hiring, those are the things that help candidates stand out. So when there are candidates who have very similar levels of experience, similar types of experiences, those are the sorts of things where that's what makes somebody more interested in you than another candidate, is showing that you're genuinely interested in this position, this company. And that really is an easy way to stand out, is to take a couple of minutes to do some of that research. Another typical question that people ask about are those strengths and weaknesses, right? So when they're asking about strengths, you do want to think about genuinely, what do you feel like are your best strengths and skills, but what's relevant to the role. So, do you really want to focus on kind of your leadership skills if this is a management position? Do you want to focus on your research skills? What feels most important to highlight here? So, they may ask it kind of as like singular or plural. I would generally try to focus on one or two strengths. You don't want to just start listing off things, because it's better to kind of go in depth and give, again, a specific example of your strengths than to just go through a laundry list of generalized strengths. So it's always helpful to kind of give that overall feeling about, if you're talking about your management skills and then going into specific situations. So, in your current role, you've helped doing a lot of like mentoring, supervising for this department. what you've like particularly enjoyed, what you feel like your strengths are in that area. So, if you're thinking about like your kind of planning organizational skills, maybe that's something you want to focus on. You can talk about how you're able to break down projects or goals into tasks and timelines to be really efficient, and like how you leverage that skill. So if you had to plan a large scale event as part of your role, like you were able to use those planning skills to plan this out when it was, an event that had a 6-month runway, right? And you want to make sure this is a question that you can respond to quickly. It's a little bit off-putting if people aren't able to articulate their strengths, if it seems like they're kind of having to take a minute, they're not feeling as confident about what to share here. Because again, if you aren't able to talk about what you're good at, what your strengths are, nobody else can do that for you. So, if this is something that you do struggle with a little bit more, come in, we can talk about that. But make sure this is really a question that you feel like you can nail in an interview. And for weaknesses, I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. Negative focus questions are less common in most instances. The reason why people ask this when they do is, first of all, they want to know, do you have some level of self-awareness? Because if you're just giving the response you think they want to hear, like, I just work too hard, I just care too much about my job, that doesn't really feel genuine. That doesn't feel like an authentic actual answer. So they want to know it is something that, you do have as an actual weakness. But then also, what are you doing to work on it? We all have flaws and quirks, but what are you doing to overcome that weakness? Or how have you improved on that over the years? So you also do want to choose something that is not going to be a red flag for that particular position. So for instance, if you were applying for a job as a teacher, you don't want to say like, oh, well, sometimes I just really don't have a lot of patience. Like, children can be trying, right? Like, if you don't have patience and you want to work with kids, that is probably not a great fit. So you don't want to choose something that's going to be a huge issue. Choose something that's like a little bit less related, a little bit smaller issue. And avoid kind of overly descriptive language. So, maybe something where it's like genuinely like you do struggle a little bit with perfectionism, like you keep working on things and, not sure if it feels good enough to you to be done with a particular project. So, that's a legitimate like you can talk about that. But if you're using that descriptive language and you're saying things like, oh, I just have such high standards for myself, like sometimes I get a little obsessed about it, and you're using strong language like that, sometimes that's kind of a red flag. And then your interviewer may wonder, like, how big of an issue is this? Is this going to be impacting your daily work? So, having that in like a little bit softer language. So like, oh, sometimes I do have perfectionistic tendencies. So, that's something that I've really learned to work on, to kind of know, like, when I feel good about my work, but that I'm not expending more effort than is needed or getting behind on other projects, right? So you're still saying the same thing, but it sounds a lot better when you're kind of framing it that way. So, another example of something you might say is, if you're somebody where I love to jump into new projects, but sometimes I get caught up in the work before realizing I don't have all the information or resources that I need. And so I get stuck at a certain point. So now when I get a new project, I take the time to make some notes about what I need, questions I need to ask before I'm getting too far into the project. And this has really helped me be successful in my internship, kind of manage those project timelines more effectively. So again, you're kind of addressing, what do you do to work on that as a weakness? Some of the other common questions, that I would be prepared for, they might ask you about kind of your proudest accomplishment, whether that's in like your specific role. So like, what are you most proud of from your current position in your career overall? Again, if there are any kind of those negative, like you didn't meet a goal, have you ever failed at a particular project, kind of addressing that in the same way the weaknesses, not talking about something with huge repercussions, but sort of a minor instance of that, what you would do differently, how you address that for future to make sure that situation didn't happen again. Any of those other typical transferable skills, so multitasking, leadership, teamwork, any of those sorts of things, collaboration with other individuals, what have you kind of done with that in your current roles? And then something else is kind of those long-term career planning. So they may ask you, where do you see yourself 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And if they're asking kind of more of those goal-oriented questions, you want to make sure it's relevant to that position and that company. So, even if you have other goals, make sure it's kind of focused in for that. So it's not like, oh, well, I really want to focus in more on like a different career area, something like that, but something that is kind of accomplishable. So maybe you want to get a certificate in your field. Maybe you want to move into more of a management role. Like, what would kind of be that next step up for you in terms of your knowledge or your specific position? And that it is something achievable, right? So you're not going from an entry-level position and you want to own your own company in 5 years. Like, that does not feel particularly realistic, right? So kind of thinking about just those manageable goals you have. Doesn't mean you have to have your whole career plotted out for them. Like I said, kind of taking notes, I think, can be just a helpful way to do this, and maybe kind of outlining, like, for your strengths, what are those things that are most important to you that you would want to share? Any of those kind of typical questions, because again, those skills are often things that are harder to teach. You can teach somebody, like, here's how to use our random system that we use at our company to do, a financial statement processing, whatever that is. But helping a professional learn to be more organized, that's not something that they're probably going to want to invest as much time in. So you want to make sure that you're doing a really solid job of answering these questions. So then when you do have those more specific content focused questions, so, if they're asking you about a programming position, you can speak to, yes, here's my experience using C++, or here's when I've created an app, whatever that might be that you're kind of going through those as well. And then finally, you want to make sure that you have questions to ask an employer in an interview. So at the end, depending on how long they've scheduled you for, how long your responses were, you might have time for 1 or 2 questions. You might have time for more than that. I would always kind of have like 3 to 5 questions prepared, because sometimes they may share some more information about the position that kind of answers your questions, or if you're talking with multiple people, you kind of may have already gotten that answer. So I would have a couple prepped, even if you don't have time to ask everything. But this is just another way to stand out, show your interest in the position. So, you can kind of see some general examples here, about, like, what's a typical day in this position? What's a typical kind of career path for this role at the company? Who else would you be working with, in terms of kind of the organizational structure? What are like the biggest challenges or opportunities in this position? Performance expectations. If there are other individuals in your interview, it can be helpful to ask them about, kind of the environment, kind of teamwork style, like how do they work together? What's the supervision management style like? What's their favorite part of working at that organization? Because, if that's something where it takes them a minute to think of something to say, maybe that's not a great sign if they can't come up with a positive reason that they enjoy being at the company. Anything about kind of training, professional development opportunities. Those are all kind of general things you can ask. If they don't share kind of a timeline, I think that's always a good thing to just inquire about, just kind of what are their next steps? Do they have kind of a potential for hiring timeline? Because that just gives you a little bit of information to know if they're wanting someone to potentially start in April. That gives you a sense of like, if you're not hearing back by a certain point, or if it is kind of going to work for you. You can also ask about things like kind of what this person would likely be needing to accomplish in their first, month, 2 months of work. What kind of characteristics have helped people be successful in this position before. It's always a good idea to ask more specific questions. So if you're really interested in a particular aspect of the role, or, you want to ask like, oh, what kinds of like processes or maybe software programs do you use for this path? Any of those kind of more content focused pieces. So those are always going to be the most important ways for you to stand out, but some of those kind of general questions can be helpful too. So all of that research that you did early on is going to help you create those questions. And, sometimes you can also get a sense as you're going through an interview of what do they care about. So, if they keep focusing on kind of assessment aspects and, like really seem to be very focused on like data, maybe you want to ask a question related to that, because that's going to show that you're sort of listening to them, what they seem to be caring about. So, as you're going through the interview itself, sometimes those questions will come up as you're kind of getting more information, understanding what they're caring about. And then finally, I would always recommend just kind of sending a really brief follow-up, whether that's, an email, LinkedIn connection. You certainly can handwrite things. At this point in time, I would say usually email is the best way to do that, because it's going to be instantaneous. You don't have to worry about dropping something off or mailing, or somebody's working remotely and they're not even in the office. So that's why it's always important to get those names, information up at the beginning, so that you know who you were talking with, who all was in that interview. And most people don't do this. Like in any given interview situation, maybe, 1 or 2 people out of the handful that interviewed would bother to send a thank you note, kind of follow-up email. And so again, there are multiple people with kind of similar backgrounds, experiences, it's just another minor way to stand out, show that you appreciate that they took the time to interview you. So it doesn't have to be very long, just kind of thanks for their time and consideration, and then just something that you appreciate learning about. So like if you asked about, something at the company, their experience, just kind of acknowledging that can be helpful. And then, we have additional resources on our website and connections page about interviewing. My interview practice is linked in here as well. So I'll send this information out to you all after the event. You can also make an appointment with your career advisor. So if you want to practice actual questions, you can do that at any point. It is helpful if you have a job posting to say, like, this is what I'm really interested in. And then we can kind of create more specific questions that are tailored to that. But we can also always practice those general interview questions as well. So any questions that you all have in terms of interviewing?